100 pages on just the workhouse before they had the children's home. I thought you might find it interesting. Anyway, so George Nichols was a member of this Poor Law Commission. In England, approximately 1820s, 1830s, they decided to redo the Poor Law in England. Now, the Poor Law in England is a fascinating and very, very old phenomenon. Basically, the Poor Law means that the degree to which local parishes were compelled by law to look after the poor people. That's what it means. And it's very, very ancient in England, unbelievably. You're talking 1300s, you're talking Henry VIII, fascinating story. Anyway, in Ireland, there's no such thing for all those periods. Pretty much empty. There's no law in Ireland looking after poor people per se, not a law as such. So anyway, they reformed the Poor Law in England, and they have these Poor Law commissioners in charge of it. So they sent this man to Ireland, George Nichols, to suss out the situation in Ireland and see if they're going to extend the Poor Law to Ireland. It was the first time it ever happened. Now, the interesting thing is that the Poor Law in England, as I say, it's a very. Can you all give me the back there? Anyway, the Poor Law in England it's a very fascinating, complicated question. But in Ireland, it's a blank slate. And of course, in Ireland, there's a huge amount of work already put in by the Devon Commission, etc. It's talked about Irish poverty and whatever. So they're going to solve the problem of Irish poverty. And they sent this man over to find out how to do it. So the result of his inquiries was to setting up of these poor law unions all across Ireland. They sent about 11 people from Ireland to England to study with the Poor Law Commissioners in Somerset House in England. They came back to Ireland and they walked around Ireland. So about 11 assistant commissioners and the Poor Law Commissioners. The guy that came to Tuam was a fellow called Joseph Burke. He was a barrister, and he was a relative of Sir Bernard Burke of Burke's peerage. He was from Tipperary, and he was an historian himself, and he kept copies of his letters and all the rest of it. And you can go through his letters now in National Archives in Dublin. So the procedure is, right, he comes to Tuam, he negotiates with some of the big landlords in Tuam, and he decides to set up what's called a Poor Law Union. Now, the phrase a union comes out of the Poor Law in England. About the 1770s, they amalgamated different parishes. It was the parish that was in charge of the Poor Law in England, and they amalgamated a few of them together, forming a union. So that's the phrase comes through, the Poor Law Union. So they just decided to come to Tuam and they're going to set up this union. They're just blank slate. They just had a map in front of them. They had no regard for even the county boundaries. They just had, okay, here's Tuam, nice little town. We'll put a circle around it, and we'll negotiate with the different landlords as to what would the boundaries be. That's the way they did it. They formed the union. They meet about, I think that's 1839 in Tuam. And the first discussion, by the way, is about whether the press were allowed into Tuam, because Tuam, of course, has a very distinguished local newspaper. And that became a big issue in the Tuam union all throughout. And the other issue was that they had to elect a secretary, who dealt then with the assistant commissioner. Apparently was hopelessly incompetent, according to Joseph Burke anyway. So they got rid of him after a few weeks and put in a new secretary. Anyway, right, so they formed the union. Then the next step is to create a workhouse, which is going to solve all the problems, the social problems, if you like, in the whole locality. An old people's home, a children's home that will be abandoned, absolutely everybody that's, and of course the indigent poor. The interesting thing about it was that when they held these discussions in England in the 1830s to form the reform of the English Poor Law, what they wanted to do was, in a kind of a way, to make it more harsh than it already was. Curiously enough, that was the reform. They felt that people were lazy and they were just taking advantage of the poor law. So they introduced a system whereby you would never want to take advantage of the poor law unless you were massively poor. You were desperate, and that's the only reason you were. So they wanted to create a structure whereby they could capture the phenomenon that you were genuinely desperate. In other words, they had to make the workhouses so bad that only the desperate would want to enter them. That was the plan they had. It sounds a bit bloodthirsty, but that was their plan anyway. And that's why when they built these workhouses, right, and the poor people could come into them, but they could only come into them under very stringent circumstances. One being that had to separate if there were families, and the only reason they did that was to make it harsh. That's the only reason. So that people wouldn't want to enter it unless they were desperately poor. That was they call it kind of the indigent test. Anyway, so they built workhouses, right? Now, in Tuam, the local committee is they formed this union. The guys in charge of it would be the local landlords, effectively. Now, some were appointed ex officio, some were elected, and they call them the Board of Guardians. Now, the Board of Guardians then would be expected to create the workhouse, but actually they didn't do very much. Poor old Joseph Burke had to do everything, and he managed to wheedle his way into renting some land from the rector of Tuam. The rector of Tuam had land under the bishop. and he managed to fiddle away to get it, to rent it. He only rented it though, and then built the whole workhouse on top of that. So we're talking 1840 to 1842 was actually built. An unbelievably huge affair. I have a picture of it here with me. Yeah, well, they're the actual plans of Tuam Workhouse. As you can see, Tuam there at the top. And I'll just put that corner of it there because that's the corner that we'll all be talking about later. You'll see it up there. There. That is where everybody talks about since. As you can see, there's nothing there in the Tuam Workhouse plans. So if anybody tells you that the underground structures, blah, 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 they didn't at the site we're talking about. But notice this here. That's the morgue of the Tuam Workhouse. That's therefore not too far from where we're talking about. If people are familiar with the site, you know there's a bit of a little access road. You walk down to the little gate and you go into it. Well, the opposite direction on the access road, directly opposite, you see kind of a shed. It's quite a prominent block shed. And that's exactly what that morgue was. And actually, they did find bodies underneath that. Not surprisingly, there is a little underground structure attached to the morgue. Anyway, that's just the plans of the workhouse. And there you see the elevations. And down there, I know you can't see it now, but that's his signature, George Wilkinson, the workhouse architect, the poor garden architect. And there's a look at some of the actual buildings inside, the elevation inside. Now this is your workhouse, right? Now it's interesting. They employed a guy called George Wilkinson, and he was, I think, from Oxford, and he was influenced by the kind of the Tudor kind of architecture of the time in Oxford. And he put great work into designing this building anyway, and he put lovely little little features. If you look at that building there, you see kind of little Tudor arcades. I don't know what you call them, little shelving kind of. There is a genuine Tudor influence on this building. Anyway, the beginning of it is the sort of the boardroom place. That building there. That's where they would have held all the local government offices in Tuam at the time and everywhere around on it. And the porter lived there. And then you move down through that and you're to the main building. The centre of the main building is the master's house. Now, as I say, this thing is run by the Board of Guardians, the local committee. But they did have a man on the ground employed by them actually living in the workhouse, known as the master. And he lived right there in the centre of the wide building. And to your left, you get the women's wards where they lived in those tall buildings there, and to the right you get the men's wards where they lived there. As I say, they're all separate. Many of them are completely separate all the time here. You go down to the centre with there, and that's the oratory stroke dining hall. And you might wonder why it's oratory stroke dining hall. Well, it's the same thing. It was the same building. They didn't waste buildings there. You sat down and had your porridge, and then you had mass or whatever. And of course, it's designed obviously by Protestants. So the interesting point is they didn't have a proper altar. And actually, in about the 1842-43, there were a lot of complaints about this. They don't have a proper altar for when the priest comes in. So they had to make one, and they made a kind of a portable one. You can see that in the architect's plans. They have this little thing that rolls along on wheels. So at the top of the dining hall, when they wanted to do mass, they wheeled in this bit of an altar and had mass and wheeled it out. So it's the same building, okay? The oratory and the dining hall, so same building. And in time, that's the oratory now of the Tuam Workhouse. So where you are here, again, just there is where we're usually talking about, and that's the oratory there. And of course, you probably know here in Tuam that there was an execution on the wall, just at the wall of that oratory. So when you go into the site around the playground, you'll see this monument to the people executed. Well, that's where they're executed, at the wall of the oratory. I think it's the far wall. I think it's that wall there. So you can see that's there, and that's where you're going down to the site. And now, also, it's very important to note, you have an infirmary at the back, right? So obviously, you're creating this sort of local government structure to solve all the problems of local poor, blah, blah, blah. You want a hospital, you want an infirmary. So they always had this infirmary at the back. Now, in Tuam, in time, that was run by the Mercy Nuns. It was run, in fact, almost from the beginning, the Mercy Nuns were there. The Mercy Nuns were then kicked off in about 1865, I think it was. And then they found that they couldn't run it. You see, they had this concept that they only wanted to have state run. It had to be a huge separation of church and state. So when you're into 1850s, 1860s, it's a bit of a scandal that you have church authorities involved in running this hall. This is very much run by the state, and you can't have the church involved. So they kicked out the nuns, effectively. There was a disagreement about they made a teacher, a secular teacher, and it caused a controversy. But anyway, they kicked out the nuns on this separation of church and state. Then they found that it was running down. So as you get to the 1880s, 1890s, you hear a lot of complaints about Irish workhouses. The infirmaries are filthy, they're just terrible. The fact of the matter was that the Board of Guards didn't have enough money really to run it all that well. And the fact was that the nursing orders in the religious orders were very efficient. So they bit the bullet and they invited them back. So in 1894, they invited the Mercy nuns back, and they did a superb job by all accounts. And so they created, if you like, a hospital out of the infirmary at the back, which, as you can see, is near enough our site. So that's here. This is the hospital, and there's our site there. There can work there. So that's run by the Mercy nuns from 1894. They actually were running it even while the British Army were on site, because as you probably know, an awful lot of these workhouses were then occupied by the British Army. In fact, it's remarkable. And some people of a conspiracy frame of mind might think that that was one of the reasons they built them. Because if you think about it, all across the west of Ireland, all across Ireland, they built these giant, huge stone-cut buildings with beautiful, very large stone-cut walls around them, very secure buildings, and very useful for the military. So they might have known that from the beginning. And anyway, they were very routinely occupied by the military from the time they were built, especially here in Tuam. The army was there virtually all the time. And even though the army was there, the Mercy nuns still around that hospital, all through the Irish War of Independence. Well, this is quite a military affair. And they were still there when the Free State Army took over from the British Army in 1922. The Mercy nuns still stayed there, and they were still there at the beginning of the Civil War. And there was explosions and gunfire flying across them. And so they got out then, they said to hell with that. And it was then occupied just by the Free State Army. Then in Tuam, it's May 1925, the Free State Army leave, and then we start the whole story about the workhouse, or the children's home. So anyway, just to talk about the children's home for a second. Now, as I described, frequently about 1880s, 1890s, 1910s, the workhouses brought in Irish religious orders. Now they did it because they simply couldn't run these places properly on their own. The Irish religious orders had a tremendous commitment to teaching, to hospital care, etc., etc. So all across the workhouses of Ireland, it's a very frequent phenomenon. You find the Mercy nuns, you find Christian brothers in certain circumstances coming in to help out to run the place. Now, the Bon Secours nuns were asked to help out in the workhouse in Glenamady. Now, I think it's 1895 or some date like that, they were asked to come in. So the Bon Secours nuns are a French order. They had come to Dublin and then to Cork, where they are still. And they were famous in Dublin around Mount Street, and they also helped out in medicine in a lot of the Catholic boarding schools around Dublin. And they were famous in Mount Street in Dublin, which is obviously inner city Dublin, for setting up what they call the penny dinners. So they were helping the poor in Dublin. Anyway, at some point they were asked to come to the west to help out in the workhouse in Glenamady. So they set up the workhouse in Glenamady. So when you hit the middle to autumn 1921, there is your structure, okay? You've got local government running these. It's still the same kind of committee that this guy set up around Tuam. It's still the Board of Guards, right? Then independence, obviously. Now, obviously you might say formal independence is the treaty at the end of 1921, and maybe not, it's kind of independence from the truce about the middle of 1921. Actually, they solved the problem of the workhouses before the treaty, for some reason anyway. They decided to solve this one in about the autumn of 1921. So what were they going to do? They decided they wanted to run Irish social services on a county level and not in this local level. So around Galway, you've got your Glenamady, your Portumna, your Galway City, all these workhouses. And they reckoned they didn't need that many of them. And so they would condense them into having the Galway City one made a hospital, the one in Corrolea made an old people's home, and the one then in Glenamady, they were going to make a children's home. And they would kind of close down the rest. Now, by the way, a lot of the rest of them also were kind of burnt and damaged because they were involved with the military affairs. And particularly Glenamady. In Glenamady, the local IRA were told that the British Army were going to come on site. That's about, I think it's March 1921, because the British Army were routinely occupying workhouses. So the IRA went in first and burnt it down. Now, they burnt down most of the workhouse in Glenamady, other than the oratory and the master's house, and I think the infirmary. So actually, it was mostly burnt down already anyway. And so when the Galway County Council decided to set up a children's home, with the Bon Secours and put it in Glenamaddy. They didn't have much space because it's only a smaller workhouse, Glenamaddy, and it was mostly already burnt down. And to add to the troubles, the master was still there. Remember, the master is in that building in the centre. He was still living there when the Bon Secours nuns were trying to run this children's home in Glenamaddy. So anyway, bottom line, the committee set up to amalgamate the workhouses in Galway had decided on this structure. They were going to close down most of them and they were going to set up a children's home, and they agreed with the Bon Secours nuns to give them a certain amount of money per week to look after these children. That would be a state aid. So it's all done by the county council, but they're kind of the local management. It's a bit like you own a house or whatever, but you employ these local managers to handle rent or whatever. And that's kind of the structure. You pay them a certain amount of money. So that's the way they did it. So the bottom line, they set up this thing in Glenamaddy. They asked the Bon Secours to look after children there. But as I say, very unsatisfactory building. Not only was it half burnt down, not only was the master there, but the water supply was appalling. Apparently it was condemned. They only had a bit of a pump, and that was condemned as horrible water anyway. So it was a nightmare. Glenamaddy was a nightmare. But you'll notice the dates, right? They set up in Glenamaddy about November 1921, and they have these complaints about March 1922, going into 1923. For those who know your history, and you know this one, that's the Irish Civil War. So they couldn't solve the problem in the middle of the Irish Civil War. As well as anything else, a lot of the workhouses were still occupied by now the Free State Army. So you had to wait a while for the Civil War to end. So they had to stay in Glenamaddy, even though it was very unsatisfactory, whatever. Then eventually, the Free State Army left the workhouse in Tuam. And that's, I think, May 1925. When they left in Tuam, the Bon Secours were able to move from Glenamaddy, which as I say was condemned by everybody, and moved into Tuam. Okay, so that's the basic reason why they're there. As I say, the county council ran it, and the county council had a particular. When they took over the local board of guardian functions, they set up a few committees. They set up one committee to handle the acute hospital in Galway, and they set up another committee to handle the homes that they were setting up, the old people's home in Loughrea and the children's home in Glenamaddy, and the homes, and then the home assistance that used to be conducted by the poor law guardians. The poor law guardians, as well as having this workhouse which you could go into if you were stuck, they give you a little bit of assistance to keep you even outside the workhouse. They're called home assistants. So I have this committee to handle the two homes and the home assistance, and that was set up by the county council, and that's then the committee that runs the home. So it's a committee. First of all, it's set up on its own. Then when the Irish state gets going after the treaty, etc., they set up in each county area a board of health to handle all of this. So they set up in Galway a board of health. Now this committee, generally speaking, the board of health is kind of a subset of the county councils, mostly councillors. But there are a few ex officio people, but it's mostly councillors. It's set up under a very complicated system, whereby they wanted everybody of all political persuasions to be able to get onto the board of health, and for all parts of Galway would get onto the board of health. Very complicated system. Anyway, so after a few years, they set up the Board of Health, and then they make this committee a subcommittee of the Board of Health. So now you get the structure, okay? This committee, the Homes and Home Assistance Committee, becomes a subset of the Board of Health of Galway, which is in practice a subset of Galway County Council. Right? They run the whole show until about 1942, when they abolished the Boards of Health. And at that particular time, they'd also kind of abolished the county councils in a kind of way, because they set up the county manager system, which of course is still with us. So in practice, from 1942 then until the end, which is 1961, it's run by the county manager. So okay, so you have the simple situation. This Homes and Home Assistance Committee runs it from the beginning until about 1942, then the county manager directly runs the home. And as I say, they've sort of subcontracted out some of the things to the nuns, but it's the county council that runs it. Now, so that's the overall history. Sorry if I've run too quickly through, but that's the overall history. Now we might as well come to the controversies. Right. Now, there are two basic controversies about the children's home, I think it's fair to say. One is the death rate in the home, whether it's too big, and the other is the question of how they bury the people. So let's look at the death rate, right? Now, we know this famous death rate because we have the death certificates of people who died at home. It's about 796, I think. It's a large number. Obviously, it depends how many people were in the home to know whether that's a high death rate. So I took the trouble to find out as best I could how many people were in the home to match it to the death rate, even though I don't have the actual books of the home, which the state does have, but I don't have. So I could only do it from some newspaper records, etc. But as far as I could tell anyway, I could find out roughly what was in the home, roughly then who died every year. And that gave me the Tuam home mortality rate, which is that one there. Because that's the Tuam home. This is supposed to be in colour. Yeah, it's supposed to be in colour anyway. And then obviously I'm matching that against the national mortality rate. Now, as you can see, when we're in Glenmaddy anyway, it was very bad on occasion. Occasion meaning an epidemic, of course. They had epidemics of measles. But as you get towards the end, in fact, the home rate is actually better than the national rate. But certainly in some of the beginning, it looks to be high. So if you were to map that out and do your statistics, you would find, I would say that the nominal rate in the home could be as high as twice the nominal national rate. Now, but I use the word nominal advisedly. Okay, so I'm saying that the headline news is that yes, there would have been twice the rate of in the home as opposed to nationally. But for the headline news, you have to get in the statistics, and there's lies and statistics, and that's what they tell you. So you have to get in here and ask the statistical questions here. Now, the first thing you notice is that the Tuam home is a transient population, which makes a big difference. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that you have this building here, right? And you calculate what's the death rate of the families here, and then you match that against some other person living in some building down there, which is great. But when you have a transient population, a lot of complications arise. So what happens here is that you get children born in the home and living in the home, etc., but then they're leaving immediately. Now, the way it worked was, after a year, the mother could take the baby out with them, or not, according to what she wanted to do. And also, they might be fostered out or adopted out. So that's the basic structure from about the age of 5, typically. Foster at the age of 5. Now, adoption only comes in much later, about the 1950s. But anyway, you can see the structure. People are coming and going, if you like. Now, think about this for a minute. They're obviously not going to take a baby out of the home that's ill. So the mother, after the year, is going to take away the baby, but not an ill one, because she'll have to stay in the home, And the same with the adoption process, and the same with the fostering process. They're not adopting out the ill people or fostering out the ill people. Now, this makes a huge difference to the statistics. You see, because that means you're keeping in the home the ill ones, and you're just messing the whole thing up. And if you work it at that, you can change that figure in half if you actually calculate the effect of this transient phenomenon. That's one point about the statistic. The second point is that you're matching the mortality rate in the home against the national rate. Okay, that's beautiful. Now, the problem is not the home rate, because we have the death certificates that seem to be properly registered. We even got baptism records of the people in the home. But the national rate is what people are ignoring here. You see, you're talking 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. There was a huge amount of non-registration of deaths in Ireland at that time. The national statistics are not all that reliable. And you read plenty of complaints to that effect. Now, what does this mean? Okay, again, you're trying to look at what happens in the home versus what happens outside the home. Okay, you have a person dies after 2 hours in the home, unfortunately, they die. Now, what happens next? Well, you have all of the bureaucracy that they handle in the home. They have nurses in the home, they have doctors in the home, they have an assistant commissioner who particularly handle a lot of the bureaucracy. So they fill out the death certificates and the birth certificates, etc. They handle all the bureaucracy. Now you picture a cabin in Galway in the late 1920s, right? And you have a baby that was born and died after a few hours. What are they going to do? Why did they bother register the birth or the death? They probably didn't. They just didn't a lot of the time. Now you can see from that fact that you end up with a skewed statistic. You end up with a good statistic for what actually happened with deaths in the home versus a bad statistic what happened outside the home. And you'll find that does skew the thing a lot as well. So you've ended up saying that there's a lot of deaths in the home only because there were none recorded, the ones that happened outside the home. And that makes another big statistical effect. Now, the third statistical effect I will point out to you is a question of what I call, just in simple terms, the hospital effect. Now, what do we mean by that? Okay, you go to Dublin, right, and you roll up your sleeves, you're going to find out the statistics. What's the death rate for those people who live in the Gresham Hotel in Dublin? Right, you do that, and then you go to another building not that far away, the Mater Hospital building in Dublin, and you find out what's the death rate of the people living in the Mater Hospital in Dublin. obviously you'll find that 100 times more people die in the Mater Hospital than die in the Gresham Hotel. Why? Because you're very seriously ill, you go to the hospital and you don't go to the hotel. It's not a very complicated phenomenon. If you're very ill, you go to a hospital and then you die there, and that's why you get high statistics. Now consider this. This is an advertisement in the Connacht Tribune in 1930. Sorry, it's not an advertisement. It's a reference to a meeting of the Home in 1930. A reference to the meeting of the committee that we're talking about. And there they talk about the fact that the Bon Secours nuns were setting up a shelter for delicate children, is the phrase used, at the Home. And they were hoping that the state might give them a few bob for it, but it doesn't say there whether they did or not. But it does say they set up a shelter for delicate children. Now what do we mean by that? We mean then that people who were delicate children around Galway and Mayo were attracted in to come to this particular shelter, not necessarily illegitimate children born in the home. We're talking about if you were born and you had a child who was chronically ill for some reason, now not acutely ill, because then you go to an acute hospital, but chronically ill. It seems then, what are you going to do? Maybe very, very severely handicapped, maybe both mentally and physically handicapped. What are you going to do? It seems, therefore, that you send them to the Tuam home, because that was the idea behind having the shelter. So again, you're attracting in ill people, if you like. It's the same hospital effect as affects the Mater Hospital. So then it's not surprising that you get a high death rate among children in the home. Now, I would say definitely, it certainly was the case that they brought in some chronically ill children, and I would say specifically mentally ill children. If you read the records of this home, they go on and on about idiots and congenital idiots, whatever. They're obviously referring to Down syndrome children. There was definitely a phenomenon whereby they attracted the mentally handicapped into the home. And unfortunately, Down syndrome children have a lot of problems with lungs and hearts or whatever, and often die young, especially those days. So there again is a big reason why you've got a high death rate in the home. So there's a whole load of factors. Now, you do also have a question of epidemics, the fact that you have hundreds of children together. And by the way, the state was quite conscious of this, that they had hundreds of people together, and they advised, the national authorities advised the Tuam home to break them up into separate nurseries, which they did do. So they did all that they could to handle this question of a measles epidemic when you have hundreds of children, but there still wasn't much of an answer. So that's the fourth reason, if you like, why you'd have a death rate in the home, is you have these epidemics, and you couldn't do much about it if they're all housed in the one building. Hundreds of children in one building, they're all going to get the measles, whatever. Whereas if you were in a rural area, people wouldn't go to school when you had an epidemic, and maybe you might avoid it then. So you have epidemics, whooping cough, influenza, measles. So anyway, for those reasons, I think it's very clear why there is a high statistical death rate in the home, and it's not because the nuns or anybody else were negligent. In my opinion, that's absolutely not true. Now we come to, the only bit of evidence that I've seen that people present to show that there was a bad treatment of people in the home is this word used in the death certificates. It's called marasmus. So in other words, they wrote out the death certificates and they wrote out the cause of death, right? And the word they used in some cases was marasmus. Now, the way to understand marasmus is that you have a child, right? He doesn't seem to have a fever, but no matter how much he ate or whatever, he just seemed to debilitate and die. And there are a whole lot of reasons for marasmus, but it is true that if you don't eat properly or don't eat anything at all, you're going to get marasmus. But there are other reasons. Now, a whole lot of other reasons to do with digestive problems, etc. I have that in the book if you want to read it. But I thought this reference was very interesting. Now, the Department of Local Government and Public Health reports are a continuation under the Irish state of the Poor Law Commission reports and then the local government reports. There's actually a continuous stream of reports that come out every year on the kind of local government and social welfare kind of system. Now it's very interesting, on the one from 1933, they refer to a 1931 investigation in Cork. In Cork in 1931, the authorities wanted to know why there was a large cause of death. And they found out that the causes of death were these 5 or 6 you see there: gastroenteritis, debility, marasmus, which, as I say, is kind of the same thing, kind of wasting, premature births, pneumonia, bronchitis, convulsions, meningitis, whooping cough. Then it stated in the report, it will be noted that with the exception of the second and third causes, all the others are preventable. Now think about that for a minute. The second and third causes are not preventable. Debility and marasmus and premature birth. Now, if marasmus was caused by bad food, of course it's preventable. So when the authorities viewed the word marasmus on death certificates, they were not referring to a lack of food. It was caused by other causes, obviously, because a lack of food is preventable. So if you think about that, you can see that their use of the phrase marasmus was not to be associated with the same disease you get in famines in Africa or whatever. And consider another second point, right? You take from the critics of this whole story. They say that the people in the home were terrible people, blah, blah, blah. They, did all those horrible things. The people in the home then wrote out the death certificate. So the people in the home write down the phrase marasmus. Now, obviously, they did not mean themselves that they were starving the guys to death. Otherwise, why would they say that in the death certificate? They'd say something else, wouldn't they? But obviously, when they used the word marasmus, they meant it in a different sense than just not lack of food. So it wasn't lack of food. So I think you can dismiss that reference to marasmus. I think, generally speaking, they fed them well. I don't think there's any reason to have any doubts about that. Now we come to the second great controversy affecting this particular home, the deaths, where they all die or whatever. But before I talk that, I might just talk a little bit about the sewage system and all of it, because you hear a lot of talk about that, right? This again is at the corner, you saw it, of the corner of the big map, right? There's nothing there in sewage when they built the home, okay, nothing. So there was no Victorian sewage system installed at that time, anywhere near here. Now, the points you have to bear in mind, the workhouses, when they were formed, did not have sewage lines as we understand them. Okay, they didn't have them. Why? They didn't have the water supply. They only had a pump. It was in the women's yard. To pump up the stuff, and that's how you get your bucket of water out. You can't run toilet systems like that. You see, if you think about it, when you do your business in the toilet or whatever, it goes down a sewage line because you've added water to it, and then it flows along. You have no water. Nobody flows anywhere. So originally, under the workhouses, there is no sewage as we understand it. Instead, it's a hole in the ground, right? And you can see that in the maps. It's just a giant hole in the ground. Quite a deep one, and they put a proper floor to the hole, whatever. So what do? They had to clean out these things. So they got a guy in, he shoveled up the stuff, put it on an acid cart, and off he goes. And that's what it is. It's physically moved around the place, sewage. Manure, and it's obviously used for agricultural purposes. But they did find, though, that they wanted to store the manure temporarily before they'd sell it on to farmers and whatever. So they just had a kind of a square box, that's all it was. And the way to understand it is a bit like a modern day silage pit. I don't know whether you're acquainted with these things. But a silage pit is just a concrete floor, a couple of walls, that's it, over ground. And that's all we're talking about here. So that there is your square box of that they used to store them. So as I say, an arson cart just physically comes in and dumps it there. And that, by the way, is land just outside the workhouse. You see, this here is the workhouse. For those of you who don't know the site, you see, this is the little gate comes in. That's the little gate comes in. That's the old wall, and so it's just outside the old wall. Now, it had to be outside the old wall because the workhouse authorities, the national authorities, insisted on these things being outside the grounds of the workhouse. So they actually rented land. That's actually rented land especially to build that and to store the stuff in it. So as I say, an arson cart comes into that square, puts it in, and then another arson cart comes on eventually of a farmer. They sold the stuff off and he put it on the land. That's all they had to do. Now, that's the original structure for the workhouse, just a box, no big deal. Then along comes they tried to install sewage. Now, I couldn't tell you the exact date that they tried to install sewage, but I'd say it's about the 1880s. And what they actually do, they get a little lazy about this. You see, originally when they did build this workhouse, as I say, they didn't have any underground sewage, anything, okay, apart from a hole in the ground. But they did have drainage for surface water. Because of course, well, the way you would be in your your front garden or whatever. Sometimes you get a big thing of water, and you have a little bit of a lake there. So you try to get a bit of a drainage off this. And of course, inland around Ireland, including at this time in the 18th century, they tended to have quite sophisticated water runoff under land. So you have the rain coming in, whatever. If it congregates in this particular part of the field, they put in an underground channel to move it off there. So they had such a thing in this workhouse. Now you see this line here. That's going back to the workhouse, and that's this underground channel. Now it's about, say, 1 metre square, right? And it's stone built. And it's about, whatever it is, 1 metre, 2 metres underneath the ground, and that's going straight back to the workhouse. Now, as I say, all that is surface runoff. But when they decided to put in sewage systems, they got lazy. And they decided they'd put in the sewage at the workhouse site in this underground channel and then pull it off at the end of it. So they kind of got lazy. And they built this thing here, which is, as you can see, right beside the opening to that line. And there's pipes going in there from that into this small square thing. So what they did was, they didn't use, after, I think it's about 1880s, they didn't use that square thing because they were trying to put in proper sewage. So they put in this little box that came properly along a kind of sewage line. And it has gates here, here, and here. Pipes going in here, here, here would be the gates. Kind of grills to try to hold back the detritus, whatever, and allow only the rest of the stuff to go out. And then they had a pipe going from here all the way out, down along the, as far as the railway line, which is quite a distance away. So the whole thing, now that's never a circulation, a percolation sewage. It was never used for that. It's far too small for percolation area for a workhouse. Instead, they just moved it through there and along these pipes, but they had to clean out that now and again, that little square. So anyway, that continues on. That gives you the basic framework. Okay, so you have that in your mind's eye, okay, when you come into this controversies. You have this box right here outside the workhouse where they just an area above ground where you just dump the stuff, and then later a farmer comes and collects it. Then about 1880s, they modify that. They make this very small building, you can see just above it, taking sewage in our normal sense, and then a pipe going down out of that. Right, that's the basic framework. So along comes our controversy, right? Along comes Catherine Corless. I don't know where she's here tonight, but anyway, along comes Catherine Corless. So she's looking at these old maps, and she knows that this is the modern day graveyard. That's the modern day graveyard, and she can look at the old maps, and she has this square structure that the workhouse built in 1848, and she puts one on top of the other, and ta-da, you have babies buried in a septic tank. Because as you can see, it is quite a big, the old original square takes up a lot of the modern day graveyard. So, but of course it's not all of it or like that, but that's where we get our current controversy, right? That's the only origin, as far as I can see, of our current controversy, is these maps linked one to the other. There's no oral history or anything, any documentary that would tell us that people are buried in the septic tank. Anyway, so what we've done is, I'll just go back to that for a minute. In 2017, I think, and 2016 and 15, I think, the state, 2016, early 2017, did a number of excavations. Obviously, they set up this commission. The commission has conducted a number of archaeological digs, if you like, of this particular site. Now, they did 4 digs, okay? One of them is here, 1, 2, 3, and then 4 down the centre. And then later on, they came along for their next time, and they just did this here. So that's gives you 5. Originally 4, there, and there. And then, the line down here. And then eventually they just did that. Now, so that's what they did. They dug down archaeologically to see what's to be seen. They found the old small septic tank here, septic tank or cesspool, whatever you want to call it. And they didn't find any remains in that. And it's very, very important to note that that structure there does indeed, as I say, it has these grills, but it also has pipes leading to it, into it. But that structure, they found no human remains. There's nothing to do with the human remains stuff, so don't get the two mixed up. If you see a picture of pipes coming out, that's not referring to where human remains are found. Human remains were found here, on this long structure. Right, so if you're familiar with the site, you see the statue of Our Lady, you just follow her left-hand side hand along that wall, and virtually about a foot out from the wall, and virtually along its entire length, and stretching out about a metre, or maybe down about 1.5 metres to the ground, and down a couple of metres from there. That's the structure they're talking about. There they did find human remains. This is it here. That gives you something of the size of it and the length of it. You see it here. For me, that looks like a very modern structure. It looks to me an awful lot like precast concrete like they use inside sheds, which dates to about 1780s. So what is that? Okay, let's just talk about this for a minute. Okay, so they found this particular structure, okay? Now, there's 21 openings into 20 chambers, right? As I say, this long line structure. In that, they found human remains, bones, whatever. Now that's it. So what are we to make of that? Who built it? Why is it there? What's the story? How, why, when of the structure? Now, to answer our question, what we'll do is we'll ask ourselves, well, what did the remains look like first? Now, I would put to you the one overwhelming fact that comes out from our evidence relating to children's home and indeed the family grave test before this is that they're always buried with coffins. Although there is a reference to a crypt. I don't know whether Mary Moriarty is here, but she often told me about a crypt. Ignoring the crypt for a second. So anyway, sorry, just to clarify that. Mary Moriarty fell into a hole in the ground, right, where she saw layers and she saw bodies wrapped around in shrouds. That's about 4 layers, and she was looking down this tunnel. And that's approximately here. It's outside the whole excavated area. So don't get it mixed up with all these other structures, okay? Now, I don't know the relationship between that crypt and the people buried with coffins. But maybe there was a times they ran out of coffins, I couldn't tell you. Maybe they were still bones, I'm not sure about that. But anyway, there was a crypt, okay, because Mary Moriarty fell into it, so we know there was a crypt. But otherwise from that, we know they were all buried with coffins. Okay, why do we know that? Because we have all over the place. So here's some of the evidence relating to coffins, okay? We have 19 newspaper advertisements for the children's home where they're advertised looking for coffins. We have approximately every 6 months, we are told, the commission, you see, have access to documentation from the manager's orders from the meeting of this committee. And in that, they found out that this committee was tendering for coffins every 6 months, approximately, and the manager's orders afterwards for the children's home. And Catherine Corless herself interviewed the families of, two families of carpenters' families who made coffins for the home. For the church, you remember seeing coffins were made for the home. And locally here, I was told that the local handyman who worked in the home, John Cunningham, him and his son Ger also made coffins for the home. So look, undoubtedly they were making coffins. So undoubtedly that's why they were buried. But we don't have coffins here. And that's an important point. Now, we have this ossuary, but it's just a mass of bones. There's no coffins or shrouds or anything like that. So this is a bit of a mystery. Now, so what's the explanation? Now, I would put it to you, the simple explanation is pretty clear and obvious. When they did all their development work around this site, they obviously threw up bones. I mean, we can see that, because even people working in their back gardens threw up bones. We have all these stories. So obviously, when they did this huge amount of excavation work, they dug up an awful lot of human remains. So what are they going to do with that? They just put them in the structure, in this graveyard. That's all there is to it. The workers in about the 70s would have built a long structure like that, divided in half, and put whatever remains they could on top of it, and then put the lid on top. When everything was done, finished, they put this lid across the top, and that's the origin. I don't see why anybody would dispute that as being the origin. That's what.
Sorry, could I just ask you, what's your evidence to make that claim?
Would it be okay if I answer questions at the end? I'll certainly.
Well, it's just that the Mother and Baby Home Commission of Investigation absolutely clarified what that structure is.
Yeah, but I'll answer your question. Honestly, I don't mind questions. I will answer it, but give us a chance just for my case
I'm
first.
very interested though. You've said that this was built in the 70s and 80s. You're saying this was built in the 70s and 80s.
Ask the question afterwards.
Yeah, you're right. But give me a chance and I'll say why it's built in the 70s.
Ask the questions afterwards.
Well,
Yeah.
sorry,
You're not talking. He's talking. And you can say what you like afterwards. But leave the man talk.
Yeah.
He did put up his hand, he didn't just
Yeah.
jump on it.
So,
It's wrong, like you
yeah.
did.
Okay,
You
so
jumped
sorry.
on him to be.
We have just the questions at the end.
Yeah,
And Brian is looking forward to answer questions at the
Yeah.
end.
So anyway, right, here is a map of the burial ground from the mid-70s, right? Now look at it, look at the size of it, right? Now this is our area here, just right here. But it goes all the way back there. Obviously, burial ground is written there. It's written in halfway between the... So, consequently, the original burial ground is far, far bigger than what we have now. That's obvious. So the second $6 million question is, what happens to the graves that were in that part of the structure? This is now the access road. The access road is here, it comes down there. That's the shed where we have the morgue. Access road comes down here. So obviously, The council, in their structures in the 80s and 70s, are moving this recognised burial ground and they're putting it here, because this is the current burial ground, and that is gone. It's now an access road. So, I mean, the council at times have to do this all over Ireland. They have graveyards, existing graveyards, they have to move them effectively, because that happens all over Ireland. It happened, I think, in Dunmore, not long ago there north of Galway, when they had to move their church. They had to move out their graveyard. So they do this all the time. And what do? Well, presumably, they dig up the graves or whatever and put them in here. You know, they condense it, if you like. So again, the natural way of looking at it is they just build a structure here and divide it in chambers, and whatever they get there, they just put into it. You know, that seems a very logical, simple way of looking at it. I mean, look at it this way. What otherwise has happened? What happened to the graves that are up on that part? There's also a critical aspect to this is the fact that the bones found are, as I say, a jumble of bones. Okay, now if I'm going to be buried in a grave normally, you bury me like this, right? You come along 50 years later. You will find my ribs here. You'll find my hand connected. Obviously, my flesh is gone, but all the bones are in the same shape that they were when I was alive. They call that articulation of bones. This is where you can see the same shape over time. Now, in this structure, the bones are disarticulated. They're all a jumble. Now, if they're all a jumble, it has to be the case that they were talking some kind of reburial. It has to be like that, because otherwise it wouldn't be a jumble. Now, why do I say they're disarticulated? This, for example, is a letter sent by Marie Cassidy to the North Galway corridor. Marie Cassidy is a state pathologist, so she'd be very exact about these things. And notice the way she uses the phrase, the bones were disarticulated. She's referring to the bones in this structure. And there's a lot of other references. You can see in my book showing clearly that they're disarticulated. Now, if they're disarticulated, it pretty much cannot be the case that the bones where you found them is where they were originally buried. We're talking about a reburial. Of course, they'd be disarticulated if I dug them all up and then had to rebury them elsewhere. That's where you get the disarticulation. So it's a critical aspect. It's why we can see that this structure was disarticulated. Now, here's another interesting point. This is December 1979. And these are the minutes of a meeting at Galway County Council. Now, Joseph Burke, a well-known political and commercial figure here in Tuam, he's putting down a motion. He's asking for this area to be made into a playground, and I think an access road. Really, really well. Thanks so much. So if you look at it here, you can see. Well, when he asks for this in December 1979, he refers specifically to the existence of a memorial on the site. Now, that's a reference to the guys executed in 1923 or whatever. He refers to the children's burial ground and another burial ground adjoining. So it's there in 1979, and it's going to be moved or going to be developed, which is why he's referring to it here. So it's there December 1979, and now it's going to be developed. So the answer of the motion was the Galway County Council will develop this ground in a sensitive way with regard to these burial grounds. So they were going to develop it then, and it's a very late date. It's December 1979. So in my opinion, anyway, that's the date after that they developed the site. We're talking the early 1980s, which is not that long ago. So we should be able to get somebody to come up. Anyway, that shows the kind of work they were doing. They were developing the burial ground. Now, how do you mean developing the burial? They must be moving this stuff. They're moving these burials. So anyway, right. You can come up with three basic theories then about this structure. Okay, A, it was just that they developed this stuff. They developed this whole area, right? And they just turn up human remains. So whatever human remains they do, they just put there. That could be one simple explanation. B, they could be moving that crypt, the Mary Moriarty Flint, and it's now part of the playground area. Maybe the crypts particularly, they had to move and they put the guys in here. They weren't buried with coffins, they were buried with shrouds, which might have disintegrated. And the third explanation is that they dug up at least some of these coffins. But there's no wood, there's no coffins. There is actually talk about one corner of wood, but by and large, there's no coffins to be found. So what's the explanation about that? If they dug up all these coffins, it seems that what they did was that if, under this scenario, they would have had to open up the coffins, put the bones inside, and then maybe discard the coffins beside them here. Now, what I find interesting about this is that if you look at the cross section that was drawn up by the archaeologists, which we have in this report from April this year, this is the cross section of the site. If you ever do planning or whatever, you'll be very acquainted with cross sections. That's the old cesspool, the one I talked about, the smaller one, and that's the place where they found the bones. And what archaeologists tend to do is they tend to be interested in soil layers. The idea is like, if you're an archaeologist and you're digging up a site, you go along with your shovel, whatever, you find the first 3 feet is kind of orangey looking soil, and the next 3 feet is kind of bluey look, and that's of great interest to archaeologists because you're able to date properly the various artifacts that you find. So they tend to give you these, what they call soil layers. So I drew up this diagram based on their work. And it's interesting in that respect to look at this layer and this layer, C13, C13 and C17. Now, looking at that, it seems to me that they are the two layers that are overground when they're building the ossuary to the left. So the human remains are found to the left. And you can see the way it slopes up. It states specifically that C6 goes underneath that. It doesn't hit that. So C6 is going up like this, that line there, C17, and then you have this one here. So it looks to me that those 2 layers are what is overground when they're building the ossuary on the left, if you follow me. When they built that ossuary, those 2, and it's very interesting to note that in those 2 layers they found a lot of charcoal and ash and cinders in both of those layers. See, cinder charcoal and ash. But it's only a theory, but I wonder if the simple way of looking at it is that they broke open the coffins, they put the bones in, and then they just put the wood of the old coffins along the slope beside them, and then they just burnt them off, which is why you'd have cinders and ash along those 2 layers. It's only a theory, that one, but it's what. Now, what is interesting about this? Again, you want proof on the dating here. Okay. Now look at the artifacts they found and where they are located. Okay, you've got an Irish penny dated 1971. Now remember, the home closed in 1961. So this thing here is a guaranteed Irish symbol. Came in 1974. It's found in these areas. King Crisps packet, Club Orange cans. You have and inside the ossuary itself, they have a castor oil GTX bottle, which is definitively dated after 1968. So all of this stuff would lead you to believe that thing was built 70s, 80s, not earlier, not 1961 or earlier at the time that the children was there. Because of all these artifacts showing that. As I say, inside, among the remains of the bones, you have this castor oil GTX thing, and it's definitively dated after 1968, not dated before. So all of this will lead you to believe that it's a later structure, and it matches our documentary evidence that they are developing the site after 1979. So that's, now also this report, well obviously the question is, was it a cesspool? That's the other theory. Now they did examine it for remains of sewage, to see was sewage among the soil within the ossuary. Now you look at the quote there, now the truth of the matter is that if you read these reports, they're either or. They tell you one thing, they tell you other. Some of it is very badly written that way, it's not definitive at all. But that's a quote taken from the report, page 5223 of the PDF. It states there, now remember, they're testing the soil for a sewage to see what was it a sewage to. They say the alcohol sterol fraction and hydrocarbon fraction profiles suggest that the sample examined is not material originating from a sewage or treatment plant, septic tank or cesspit. The sample examined is not material originating from a sewage treatment plant, septic tank. It is unlikely that the specific location of the question case sample was a receptacle for sewage. Now again, you can get all kinds of quotes for these things, but that's a pretty definitive one, and it's written in the last report that we get for these soil guys. For some reason, they issued 2 reports based on 2 different samples that came to them, but then they issue an addendum to the summary of findings for some reason at the very end of all this big report, and that's what they have in it, and I think it rules out the idea of sewage. But again, you know, it's up and down, but I think that quote is pretty definitive. So that's what I think is the answer. It's a reed burial. I don't see what. Now, what the commission tried to say is that this is as part of the sewage stuff and all the rest of it. I mean, I don't know whether I can go into some of their theories, which aren't very good. But one of the theories also is that it was part of the old original box. Now remember, I said that the workhouse itself had a kind of a box kind of structure, oval ground, just a box. That it was actually to use wicker in it, among the stone to try to keep it waterproof. So, and that's this thing here, in my opinion. Now, the commission tried to say that it's this here, in other words, following this line. In other words, they tried to say that the ossuary where they found the human remains is part of the old original sewerage box. If the line is here, then the box includes the human remains. Hence, the human remains were part of what originally would have been decommissioned long ago, but would have originally been a second tank, if you think about it. Now, that's what they do say in the report. And they base this on the basis that that wall there of the ossuary, that wall there of the ossuary, and that wall there of the ossuary are old masonry. So, in other words, it's a very old structure, i.e., part of the old cesspool, probably. So, if you think about it, if that's old masonry, that's old masonry, that's old masonry, then presumably you're forming a kind of a box, and you can see that as the southern end of the original box. Now, this is very interesting. I find reading this report that if you listen to the summaries given or the finished summary report, you'll be totally misled. You have to keep reading the details and keep reading the details. And when you keep reading the details, you find a strange thing. It says that the extent of the masonry is not due to the masonry of the churching, but it certainly exists as a stone wall at the base of the north face. Meaning, it's kind of complicated this, but let's just go back a little. They're saying that is masonry. That's the north face. Now, if that's masonry, so that's an old wall, that's an old wall, that's an old wall, and that's an old wall. Now, that's very strange, because this is just a glorified box. So how the heck is you have a box with this wall and this wall in it? That changes everything, right? So here's even a picture. Now you'll notice that's a north-facing wall. That is the north-facing wall, a very old masonry wall. So this changes everything. Now, if that's a masonry wall and that's a masonry wall, then I invite you to look back at the old Ordnance Survey map of that particular period that you can see there on the left. And so these are the walls of the old workhouse. This is our box, our glorified box, and this is the boundary around the box, clearly, so they can just work it, move stuff around the place, whatever. Now you notice these two old walls here. It's not rocket science to see that if that's an old masonry wall and that's an old masonry wall, then that structure there is clearly that area. It's clearly the path around the cesspool. It's blindingly obvious. But when they went to write this report, they had the facts that the north-facing wall was masonry, and they suppressed them. They wrote the report saying only that the southern wall was masonry, the two walls, and they claimed then that this is part of the old cesspool. I think it's a very devious way of doing it. But it's very obvious when you accept that the north-facing wall is also masonry, that it's just a patra, i.e. the remains were never part of even the original old cesspool. So now I just want to come to what Teresa's talking about there. I want to talk about this lady here, Julia Devali. So anyway, she was born, I think, in Oughterard, I think it's 1916 or something like that. She was in Kilmady, and then she came to Tuam, and when she came of age, she became the gardener. And she was employed by the nuns as the gardener within the workhouse, the Tuam workhouse, and then later she went with the nuns to the Grove Hospital, and then she got married and lived in Gilmartin Road and whatever. Now, because she was the whole time in the home, is a very interesting person to talk about immigration as a sort of a witness to what the home was like. And it turned out that before 1981, I think it's maybe 1980, a person that maybe you knew here in Tuam, Rebbe Milan, interviewed her. She was going to write a book about the home. And so she interviewed her, and she recorded the interviews on these tapes here, as you can see, the tapes. And so she asked him all about the home. So it's very interesting to hear what she has to say about it. Now, the tapes then, anyway, you probably know the basic story of them. This is an extract from it. Hopefully I can play some of this. It'll work. So you can see audio there shouting. Oh, yeah. Yeah. No. So, yeah, that's the difference between an HDMI cable and so I'm sorry, I can't actually play the thing, but anyway, I have four pieces of audio. If I can figure out a way of playing it, I'll play it later. Anyway, this is just one of the references that she talks about in the home. Rebbe, as you can see, that's Rebbe Milan. She's the interviewer. She asks her, do the nuns regard them? Do they regard them or treat them, the mothers, as kind of sinners? And Julia says, no, they did not. Oh, no, they did not. There was no condemnation. No, Rebbe. In fact, they were very, very nice to them. Never cast anything up to them or said anything like that hard to them at all. Oh, no, never. No, never trampled. And so you can see there that she's obviously saying there in that the nuns treated them well. And so I'll read out a little bit more about it. Yeah. I have it obviously in the book, all this kind of stuff. And so another very interesting reference. Frequently in the tapes, so anyway, you have these tapes, and a lot of the extracts have been given to these tapes. I'm sure a lot of you are aware. But in my opinion, they are not in some cases anyway, they're definitely taking them out of context. Now here's the context. Now, unfortunately, frequently she says in the tapes that some of the illegitimate mothers were very hard on the children, and in some cases tried to kill them, and that the nuns or whatever were trying to protect the children from these mothers. In some cases, I'm sure a lot of the mothers that went to the home were lovely people or whatever, but unfortunately that wasn't always the case. And she says that regularly in the tapes. She says this, the illegitimate mothers were terrible. So anyway, I'll just give you a few quotes here. There was nobody cruel, but there was nobody normal in it either cared. They weren't cruel, but they didn't care. The only cruel half of us down there were these mothers that had those illegitimate children. They used to belt hell's blazes out of the children. And they used to belt hell out of them. They used to crucify them, children. They used to crucify them now. Now, that is a reference to the mothers badly treating the children, not to the nuns. And that is actually, if you go online, and I have it here, but obviously I can't play it, you'll see a video that they made in 2017, and they have her speaking that, Julie Devine, oh, they'll crucify them. But the crucify them is a reference to the mothers of the illegitimate children. And anyway, I'll read out the reference. And in all the years that the nuns were there, they never put a stop to that ill-treating the children, because they wouldn't do it if the nuns wouldn't be around. And she goes on to great detail talking about, unfortunately, about the illegitimate children and the way they were treated. Another thing that comes across the tapes is that the nuns were very poor. They were very, very poor. They lived the same type of lifestyle as everybody lived in the home. They didn't have a dime. And they had hardly enough money for any kind of clothes. And so, for example, they were talking about the upstairs story. And Rebbe was asking her, yes, well, they must have been cold enough too at times. So because an open fire in very bitter weather, unless they had a huge one, and Julia replies, no, they had no central heating or anything like that. And they used to live in the third story above them, the third story, and they had no fires up there because there was no fire grates like dogs, fire grates, you know that. They hadn't much comfort either, so. No, many times now they told me in the frosty mornings they'd see palms in the glass. They hadn't much comfort either, no. They had nothing themselves either, no. So you see this constant theme. The nuns had nothing. They had a vow of poverty. And it's absolutely ludicrous to talk about them making money out of all this. Here's another reference. Now, they were paid a very small sum of money per child by the council, but it wasn't enough. And you can see that from this long quote. I'm sorry, it might be difficult to follow a little bit, but this is what Julia said. There were so little paid for them there, as if a farmer could dump his daughter on the nuns and give the little few pence that the council was giving them. You see, the nuns wouldn't accept that. But that was a long time ago. I think it was 10 shillings a week they were getting from them. Well, if a farmer could give 10 shillings a week for his daughter, they wouldn't accept it, because it would be only 10 shillings. You know, he'd give the same as the council was giving. Meaning that if you were an ordinary person, a farmer, you wanted the nuns to look after your child for whatever reason, they wouldn't do it for the same sum of money the council would do, because it was too little. And so you only have two specific contemporary references to how much they were getting or wasn't enough. You have that reference from Julia, which shows that it wasn't enough, and you have Dr. Halliday Sutherland, who visited the home in the 1950s, and he described how much they got, and his verdict was it was a pittance. That's his words. So that's the only two explicit references you have to the amount of money versus the expense on the home, and it wasn't enough. So I don't know how people could come up with all kinds of other theories. Now, there's another aspect that is very interesting. That obviously is this idea of selling babies. Okay, now we hear this an awful lot, and indeed the Commission, for all its flaws, rejected that. It said there was no evidence for all this selling babies or all that kind of thing. But one thing that comes clear from the tapes was that it was the council that handled all of that. So here's Rebbe. So did the nuns arrange for them to board it out, or was it the county council? And Julia says, the county council. Oh no. There you see the nuns had to do the books every so often. Rebbe asked, yes, but was it the county council then, not the nuns, the county council, or not the nuns at all, that arranged for the children to be adopted? She asked again, because Rebbe was surprised that Rebbe maybe was a bit of a feminist or whatever, and so Rebbe, and she wanted to put the boot into the nuns. It's obvious when you listen to the tapes, but she wasn't getting anywhere with Julia. But so Rebbe asked, yes, but was it the county council that did this? And Julia says, yeah, the county council, not the nuns at all. The nuns had no real say in this. No, not at all. The nuns were only working for the county council. And Rebbe asked again, tell me about this. It was the county council. It had nothing at all to do with the nuns. No, it had nothing to do with the nuns. And then, so she says that repeatedly. So anyway, all fosterage, all the stuff, but I don't think there's anything particularly wrong that they did in that respect. But anyway, whoever was in charge was always the county council. It wasn't the nuns. So I have, if you like, an appendix that covers all these quotes that I think people are taking Julia out of context, but I can't, I can't play the audio. So yeah, so that's it then. So I'll answer all your difficult queries. So if you're still there with your hard questions, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
I ask you, what evidence do you have that the Galway County Council built a chamber in the 1980s into which they put those walls? Have any of the residents any memories of this happening?
Yes.
This is a brooder film conspiracy theory you're putting forward.
Yes, residents do have memories of that.
They do?
Yeah, myself and my friend over there were talking to a guy here in this hotel a couple of months ago, and he was explaining that the people remembered the council, when they turned up bones in the home, they created this kind of box in the ground, they put the remains in it, and they covered it over at night. And they said a decade of the rosary every time they did that. And that's the memory.
Why haven't these people given that information to the Commission of Investigation into mother and baby homes?
Well, I think that the Commission, with the report, it only had one page and all the oral history collected around Tuam, which I thought was incredible.
So and perhaps they have given it. Sorry, perhaps I'm wrong. Maybe they didn't give that evidence, did they?
Yeah, maybe they did, but it's not in the report anyway.
Catherine Corless, Secretary Dublin.
Yeah.
Now, have you gone to the Commission with all those new allegations? And if not, why not?
Well, I know the Commission has my books anyway. I know the Commission has my book. I'm not sure it has the
Have you gone yourself and spoken to them?
No.
You've come to Tuam and you've given all those allegations against my intricate research, in-depth research. In fact, a lot of your maps there are mine. They're taken from documentaries. I know by the yellow marker and I know by the little red stickers.
Yeah, you're right. That did confuse.
But that's not your research, it's my research.
Yeah.
And you're turning it into your own words.
Now, yeah.
Will you go to the Commission of Inquiry? Will you explain all this to them?
Yeah.
You seem pretty certain.
Yeah, so to clarify, I did indeed get
Did you go to the Commission?
can you just talk about the map for a second?
Yeah.
I went to Galway County Council repeatedly. They gave me
No, that's not what I'm asking you.
No, but hold on a second.
I asked you a question.
I'm trying to address the question.
No, I asked you a question.
Yeah,
Did you go to the
okay,
Commission
well,
of Inquiry?
I'll answer that question in a minute as well.
No,
if I could
first,
just...
no, I'm not asking about
Okay,
County
no,
Council.
I didn't go to the Commission of Inquiry. As I say, I know they've got my books because I'm in contact
Your books?
Yeah, or the editions.
But that's not good enough. You go and give your own statement.
But
and you give your statement if you're so certain.
Obviously, it's a rather thick book. It's all
Now,
in there.
you're talking about all those houses were built by 1980. The residents were living in them. Now, did anyone see the council coming in with blocks and bricks and opening up the whole ground? I know they came in and they put in a pathway. They put in 2 foot of clay because the kind residents here looked after that graveyard since 1980 or so up to the present. Now, I've never denied them that. They're fantastic people. And I wouldn't have known about those burials only for 2 boys found the remains. And the people there said, there's babies buried there, they didn't know who they were. They presumed they were famine victims. My research proved that they were not famine victims because they couldn't be, because that after all was a sewage area. Now, is there anyone here in the room who saw the council going in, building those chambers? You couldn't surpass that. You'd have to see them. There would be blocks, there would be cement going in. Instead, all the council did, and I've been speaking to the residents, all they did was bring in clay, sand, to make a pathway in. Because those lovely people wanted to remember whatever babies were there.
Yeah, but
Anyone here?
Anybody excavations,
I
Catherine?
think anybody would.
as I say, I was here a few months ago talking to a guy who saw the council create these structures. And
The ones are dated.
I think anybody with any intelligence would know.
But
Well, that's how the guy.
yeah, but don't forget too that
The bones are dated to the period of the Tuam home.
yeah, well, that's a very interesting point. You know, and so when I wrote the first edition of that book, I thought, and I still think that some of these bones could easily be famine victims. So then the Commission comes out with their 2017 statement, and they say definitively that the bones are dated to the period of the home. And that completely, and so in 2017, they brought out this one-page statement, and they completely demolished any of the, you know, it got a huge amount of publicity, and that's really what bases an awful lot of the theories about this home. But it was only one page, they never released the scientific data behind what they stated. Until now, until April this year. So we do have a reference, April this year, why they say that they were dated. They say that they were carbon dated. They took, I think, 4 bone samples, sent them, I think it's to Edinburgh, if I remember correctly, and they carbon dated them. Okay, so they come back with the results of the carbon dating, and they say the first 3 samples were like something like 40s or 50s, I can't remember. The 4th sample was dated 1800 to 1940, I think it was. Well, it's written in the report. That's what it says.
You're saying it's a famine bone?
Oh, I would do. They say that that's within the time of the children's home, because
1955 to 40, but you want to twist. You're trying to get an alternative, and I don't know why you're doing it. Is there somebody paying you to do this?
no, unfortunately not.
Right, can I say something? It's very strange, it's very strange how RTE...
What is your agenda?
It's very strange how RTE was allowed...
We'll just have one speaker at a time, if possible.
It's very strange how RTE and the government allowed...
Excuse me, there's an enemy threat back here.
You're changing it again.
told a former resident
He just
of the
asked
home
him
to shut up.
It's very strange how RTE allowed the publicity
Okay, may we have silence, and we'll just take one question, one speaker at a time, and we'll no, this lady here, excuse me, everyone will have their opportunity here, so we'll just have one
This
person.
lady had her hand up first.
It's very strange how RTE would publish or put on it's been all over the television before the 8th Amendment was moved about the mother and baby's home.
Yeah.
There was no evidence to state that babies were thrown into a tank. The only evidence were there that young children, including my own son, saw bones thrown into a tank. There was no evidence to say the tank was put there. Yet there was houses built on that particular ground after the home was closed. The graveyard was narrowed to make an entrance in for the back of the houses, right?
Yeah,
They had to remove
exactly.
coffins. They had, as anybody with any intelligence
Yeah.
would know, when you dig a grave, you find bones, right? And you find coffins. Anybody with any intelligence would know that the government were pushing their dirty, nasty agenda to remove the 8th Amendment. And they're doing it to this day to destroy the Catholic Church. So I hope the people that have put this nasty news out, when the Muslims come and take over Ireland, we'll see how good then they will be. We'll see how nice they will be with their children having to marry men when they're 9 years old.
Excuse me, my son is black and he's sitting here and I'm an Irish woman, so stop with the racist remarks.
Well, go on,
Okay, we'll have one speaker, please. With the lady standing, just one speaker, please.
Brian, I'd like to thank you for coming here, and you clearly believe your research, and I'm not here to start a row with you because you're entitled to your opinions.
Yeah.
And you seem like a fairly articulate person, that you're well able to be challenged, so I don't expect when I'm speaking to be challenged by anybody in the room. I'm sure you're well able to stand up for yourself.
Right.
My name's Alison O'Reilly and I'm a journalist, and I would have written the story with Catherine. I'm an adoptive mother, that's my son there, he's black. So I take great exception to racist remarks being made by Irish people.
She didn't say black.
Anyway,
He said Muslim.
he's Muslim.
Excuse me, will you let the lady speak?
Yeah.
Just because it seems you control
That's
your
okay.
children.
Yeah, one speaker at a time,
Yeah,
please.
I'm not afraid of you in any way with your arms.
Please.
Go on,
You understand
Can,
that?
can we let this lady speak?
Now,
Please?
sorry for intruding there. I
You're
think I
told
have
her
to
to
have
speak.
respect, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're a gentleman friend over there.
Yes,
in
please.
Sweden.
No comments,
Yes.
please. No comments.
Carry on.
Yeah, go on.
I'm sure you're well able to stand up for yourself, Brian,
Yeah,
so we
yeah.
can speak to each other if you don't mind.
Right, yeah.
Just to point out a couple of things that you said.
Yeah.
You said you don't have exact numbers of the people who, the National Register and the mortality, that you were just going on a rough guess of the people who died in June versus the National Register. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's just an approximation.
Yeah, but it's not very likely to be far out though. You see, what happens is
But you said it's an approximation, you don't have the figures.
No, not the exact figures, no.
Okay, I just wanted to make that point, just to clarify that.
Yeah.
The second thing you said were people in the homes themselves were signing the certificates.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the people in the homes who were signing the certificates were former residents. Ina Rabbit was a former resident of the home. I wouldn't have expected her to be educated. She had no medical experience.
Yeah.
And probably no proper life skills because she spent her whole life in the home. You know, I would question who was signing those certificates.
Well, I think it could be a little bit disparaging to people who work in the home. I mean, you know, I think they were educated. The people who were in the home, they also
She
were
had no
educated.
medical experience.
I don't know what medical is, but I wouldn't be absolutely sure that
Well,
she
there was
had
no
known.
medical certification for any of these children, is my point. Would you agree with that?
What do you mean by no medical?
Well, I mean, she wasn't a medical expert to be signing death certificates.
Yeah, but obviously,
Would have been wrong.
yeah, but obviously there are also nurses attached to the home and a doctor.
That's fine, but they weren't signing the death certificates. Ina Rabbit was.
Well, I'm sure it was under their supervision. And also, by the way, there were inquests, or at least investigations, on deaths in the home as well. It wasn't always just the people in the home. There were people outside that examined deaths in the home.
But you accept that there's been no inquests and no medical certification around the deaths of these children?
No.
That's my point. Would you accept that much at least?
As far as I know, it's a legal requirement to have medical certification. And I'm sure that they met that requirement.
So it's absolutely a legal requirement.
Yeah.
They didn't have any medical certification
Well,
for these children.
I expected they did, you see. But as I say, they had a
Well,
doctor in the
there's
home.
absolutely no medical certification for any of the dead children. That's a fact.
That's not true.
Well, who has one?
That's not true.
I have
The
all
way
the
it
death
works is,
certificates.
the way it works is
Okay,
that
this,
a person
we'll let this
is,
gentleman, we'll let everyone speak, just let this gentleman speak.
the way it works on the death
Excuse me,
certificate.
Alison is
Oh, are you
finished
not
thinking.
finished?
Finish
Sorry,
thinking.
I'm just
I
raising
clarified
questions. Sorry,
later
I
after
don't
you
want to
Yeah,
interrupt.
okay, go on, keep
Yeah,
going.
no, that's
Clarified.
okay. And if I'm wrong, I accept I'm wrong, no problem. You also said that there was testimony there that they were fed well.
Yeah.
There's also a huge amount of testimony that a lot of these children were malnourished and weren't fed well at all.
Yeah.
A lot of survivors themselves would have said that.
Yeah. But of course, in your other point, you were saying that the survivors don't have much life skills, they don't have much about going on at home, but now you say that, like, you know, the survivors themselves are
Well, I'm
in
sure
a
they
position
hope
to
they
know
weren't
about
fed
diets.
well, Brian, because it would have impacted the rest of their lives.
Yeah,
You don't need to be educated to know that you weren't eating well. is my point.
Actually, you see, you do, because you need to match the diet that you're getting there according to what other people are getting at the same time. I mean, 1950s, 40s Ireland, they weren't fed all that well outside. So if you were in the home and you say you only got spuds and porridge, you weren't getting more than that outside.
It was a known fact that these nuns were self-sufficient and growing their own vegetables.
Do you know, I've read that all the time. That's completely nonsense. And I've read that countless people saying that. You look at that site, all right, the entire site, I think, is about 7 acres, right? And most of it's taken up with buildings, paths, you know, graveyards, whatever. How the heck, that gives you a maximum of something like 2 acres
Sorry,
around.
I just have to say something, okay? If you listen to Julie, sorry, I just
let Brian finish first, and then we'll go back to you.
Yeah. So you've got 7 acres on the site, right? You've got buildings, you've got sheds, you've got pathways, roads, and you've got a graveyard, etc. That gives you maybe 2 acres on that whole site. Now you've got 400 children at times, and you've got all the mothers and the nuns or whatever. You can't feed 400 children on 2 acres, no matter what you plant, nor anything remotely similar to that. So to say to self-sufficient this land is rubbish, and anybody knows that about land.
I accept that. However, these were children in the care of the state who were receiving in today's money €110, and the state employed the nuns, asked the nuns to mind these children. So they have to have some responsibility. But I know certainly in my own writings, I have not attacked all the nuns and charged them with the one brush. I have friends who are priests and nuns. How can you say that they're all the same? It's like saying all journalists are bad. You can't say that. You can't tar everyone with the one brush. They were children in the care of the state, and I would have a real issue with foster care. Even today, I'm a foster parent. I would have a real issue with the foster care system today because of the way children are being treated today in foster care system as they were back then. But they were receiving a government payment, which was quite a lot of money in a country that would have been extremely poor at the time. The other point you made was that the mothers were allowed to take the babies home after a year.
Yeah, that's right.
What evidence do you have of that?
There's a lot of evidence for that. That's all.
Brian, these were women that were being named and shamed on the pulpit. The laws of the land at the time were totally against children being born outside of marriage. These women, a lot of them had no option but to leave their children there. But certainly, I don't know any women who were able to take their children home.
Well, I'm sorry, but I do.
Yeah, absolutely, and I accept that there absolutely were people that took their children home, but the majority of children were taken off.
Oh, okay, so to clarify, do you remember that journal I talked about? That's the Department of Local Government. They remember the annual journal that comes out. They list there the Tuam Children's Home, or they list those children born, or those that left and those that stayed. It's about half and half. The mothers would take about half of them out. So I'm telling you wrong about that.
No, I know a lot of mothers, and I'm speaking on behalf of the mothers who had their children taken off them. The other point is, Brian, you mentioned Julia Devaney. Julia Devaney grew up in that home. I mean, she spent her whole life there, so it'd be fair to say that she was institutionalised, and that was her perception.
Not institutionalised, how dare you? I'm sick and tired of people talking about her, but if they knew her, they know her.
I didn't know her.
How dare you say she's institutionalised? Where did you get that idea?
She was in a home all her life.
Listen to me.
She didn't leave until she got married.
That's like saying that you went forging in your day. They were institutionalised. She wasn't institutionalised. How dare you?
Oh, okay, go on.
Julia Devaney had a right to her perception, and that was her perception. That was
your perception of her.
I also heard that she said the place was a miserable place.
Of course it was.
No,
She said that.
I actually think you
And there was a lot of crying in the place.
Oh, there probably was.
And it was a miserable place. I mean, that was her perception, but I do have, nobody has ever actually asked the two mothers, because none of the two mothers have ever come forward. But there is an 8-year-old two mother living in Dublin, who will tell you it was a hellhole. And she was a mother in the home. She'll tell you
I knew a mother that was in the home, and she didn't call it a hellhole.
But
She
that's
said
her
it was
perception. Exactly.
much better than the children that are in care
Please don't
today.
point your
10 years
finger
later.
at me when you're speaking to me.
Okay.
Everyone is entitled to their opinion.
Right,
Just
okay,
ask
well, if
Julia
you just said today, we know all about it.
Julia
But
Devaney.
you're taking the floor to yourself. You're right, you're script before you can.
My final point is, Julia Devaney was entitled to her perception, but she did say
Will you shut up and have a bit of manners of what we were you reared?
Okay.
Okay, Is there, I might go to.
Can you just reply?
I just wanted just one more thing. You said the bond securers had no money. They returned about 2.3 million in profits in the last 2 years. So one of the richest orders in the country, just to make that point. And finally, I suppose, my main point is, the way the children were discarded was disgraceful. No matter what. When the nuns left Tuam, they spent a fortune exhuming their colleagues and reinterring them in a big grave in Knock. No matter who, they were caring for those children, and they left those children.
Well, you're
into
okay.
when they exhumed their colleagues.
Okay, I mean, can I just answer that question? Right, I mean, you have a religious order to have a requirement to look after the graves of their former nuns. It's completely unrealistic to expect a bond security to dig up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children's graves and drag them all around the place. But anyway, I just
want to let Brian speak, please.
Yes. And it's just a question of the food, because it's interesting when you want to know about Julia's attitude to food. So when Rebbe was interviewing her, she said Julia describes the food in the home, and she's saying it's terrible. She's starchy food, whatever. And Rebbe is listening to her, and Rebbe was living outside the home in those years. So she says, well, it was a fairly reasonable diet, Julia. It wasn't bad, the food is good. I said, Julia's telling the food, and then Julia says, yeah, but they get mashed potatoes and butter in it, maybe hard-boiled eggs into it and things. And then Martha came along, this Victorian one, and she squatted this. We had them, I was blown up with the wrong food, they were, Rebbe. And Rebbe says, living it, and then she said, I wouldn't say the food is wrong, Julia, or bad or anything. It might have been monotonous. So Julia says, monotonous, yes. So Rebbe says, but I wouldn't say it was bad food, though, for the times. And Julia says, I suppose not. And Rebbe says, no, I wouldn't say it was. So, I mean, the people in the home, as you say, weren't always able to judge what was like outside. But outside, the people who lived during those times, during the war years particularly, and the rationing, they thought it was good food when they were told what they were fed. So, was it Catherine Corless?
Yes, Catherine, would you like to say?
If you did listen to all the tapes, like I did, I transcribed every single word that Julia DeBenny said. It took me days upon end. My transcript is every word that Julia said. Now, you're talking about the garden and vegetables and all that, and having their own self-sufficiency. Julia says they're self-sufficient. They had a huge garden. They had a lot of the women went out helping Julia. She was the head gardener. They had a huge plot. They had huge plots. Now, the 7 acres was not full with buildings. If you look at your 7 acres again there, if you had the outline of the home, you had there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot of areas. There's quite a lot of ground. And if you listen to Julia, you will realise she names out all the vegetables, and she was in care of everything, that every vegetable under the sun. Now, I don't want you to misquote Julia, because I have great regard for Julia. More than the other people here. Just by listening to her tapes, she's a beautiful woman, and I have very, very great regard for her. Now, I know every word that Julia said on the tapes, because I transcribed everything, bit by bit by bit.
Okay,
now, I know where you're misquoting her, and I know where you're putting in little bits and pieces. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, well anyway,
tell the truth.
Obviously, she worked in the gardens of the home. I am telling the truth, with all due respect. Well, stop insulting me like that. Now, she obviously worked in the gardens of the home. She was proud of it. She was proud of her pigs and pies. She talks about the cakes and cookies. She never says they were self-sufficient in the home, and they couldn't be on 2 or 3 acres. Now, that is ridiculous to say anybody who's self-sufficient. I mean, the whole country would be fabulously wealthy if that was the case. If you could feed 400 people.
Why is it taking the government so long with the truth?
So we'll take these two people in front, and then we'll come back to you. Okay, so you had a comment to make.
Just on the medical search, I'll tell you who I am. My name is Eugene Jordan. I'm president of the Galway Archaeological Historical Society. I'm a historian. I've had an interest in this because through a scientific and rational perspective on it. Now, when you claim that this person certified the deaths, that's not the case. Binder Rabbit, or whoever was the informant, and she's down written as the informant on the death certificate. What happened was the doctor certified the death, and it's recorded as being certified by the doctor in charge of the home. Bodkin Costello probably was the man. They then, usually an inmate is given the job of going to the registrar, going up to the government registrar and reporting the death, handing in the papers that were there, and that's then recorded in the register. So that's the informant. And you'll find the informant is an inmate of a lot of different hospitals throughout the country. The other point you were making on marasmus. Marasmus has been taken as this starvation, as evidence of starvation, and everybody has ran with it. There are 10 cases where it was the primary cause of death in Tuam, 14 in total. That's less than 2% of all the deaths. Now, if the nuns were starving people, they'd be starving a lot more than just 2%. It's as simple as that. You don't have to go very, very much further than that. The other point is that if you go and you look at all the other maternity hospitals, they also had deaths from marasmus. How come you're not up there charging the rotunda with murdering babies?
Yes. Yeah.
No, it's as simple as that.
Going up to the register and illegally registering children for years, right up until the 80s. So
have you evidence of that in Tuam?
I mean, you know, I exposed her as well.
I'm talking about that sort of, I don't know about
well,
that.
I excused the doctor and I exposed her.
Well, I'm just saying that you don't know about the registration process, or you're misleading people on the death registration process. You're saying that buying a rabbit certified the deaths. That's not the case. The doctor said she did not sign. She's recorded as the informant. She's recorded as the informant. She informed the registrar, and that's the way the system works even today.
Right, so
I just want to,
we'll just go, and then to you two, and then you at the. Just this lady. I've seen that. You'll be next, just right after this lady.
Okay.
Yeah.
Might only take 2 minutes. I'm just wondering, seeing as that the nuns were supposedly to blame for everything that went on in the home, how come the government have not come back with the facts? They know the facts. They don't want to give the facts because the government have an agenda. Yeah. And until we realise the government have an agenda, we continue condemning the nuns and the Catholic Church.
What's the agenda?
Well,
we'll go to Brian first, and then we'll go back to this lady, and then yourself. Well, it's a good question.
Is it the Alive magazine agenda?
Well, you know, on Twitter, obviously this controversy goes on forever on Twitter, and then sometimes throw up interesting documents that I try to look up. But one of them, it comes from the Magdalene report. Apparently, there was the health HSC intelligence unit contributed to the documentation dug up as part of the Magdalene report of 2012. Anyway, this memo was prepared by the HSC intelligence unit in 2012, and they talk about the Tuam Children's Home, and they talk a lot about it. They say they have photographs of all the children adopted to America, and anyway, they say that they're going to go through these files with a view to finding out were there any irregularities in it and whatever. So it seems amazing. I mean, you might think that the HSC should be busy dealing with, you know, with complaints nowadays, but apparently they're busy using these old files which they have got access to go through them to find out any complaints that are there and presumably leak that into the modern media. Now, I don't know why they have such an agenda, but you can speculate on that.
Why is there no inquiry into people falling off trolleys in hospitals this minute time?
Yeah,
There's no inquiry there, is there?
Yeah.
So this lady, yes, would you like to say a word?
Right. I'm proud to be here.
Well, there you are.
And you know who I am?
No.
I'm one of the survivors.
Oh, there you are.
You know, one of the mothers.
Yeah.
That's who I am.
Yeah.
You know, who was treated. With a black child. I have the black child. Now remember that. The girl, the woman at the club. Yeah. Now I want to tell you how they treated the black child. You know, the nuns, the bond secures as well. They ran the place where I was. The bond secures and the sisters, the daughters of charity.
And what place was that?
The notorious St. Patrick's Mother and Baby Home Institution, 381 Navan Road, Cabra, Dublin. Now I also know Margaret Kinley, who was 82 years of age, who was a very good friend of mine, who was one of the mothers of Tuam, Mother and Baby Home, and she had 2 babies in there. Now, the both of us know, and we are the mothers and the witnesses of genocide, for which we are the witnesses, for what the church and the state did unto us, all because we broke the original sin, and we were put to shame for it. We were treated despicable, and we weren't given food, and the children weren't either. I'll tell you what we were given. Well, gruel. Yes, they starved them, the children, and they starved them in Tuam. And I've just been up there with the 796 to say to them, I'm here for you. I respect you, I honour you, and I want dignified burials for them. And I will fight, and others with me, activists. Till we win, because we know the truth. And the government and the church want to keep putting us down and blocking us, but they won't block me. And the priest interfered with me in the chapel because he wasn't happy enough with the Christian money. Yes, yes. I'm speaking the truth. Now, so you find it funny, do you? Yeah. I want to ask you a question. Are you a survivor? You, yourself.
I'm a survivor.
You know so much about it. You must be a survivor to be able to tell me the facts of things. The facts. But you see, the differences of me and you is, you're not a survivor. I am the living survivor, the witness. One of the witnesses of what was done to the babies, to the children. And I saw them being horrifically cruel. Excuse me.
Why are you laughing at this woman? How dare you?
And don't laugh at me either. I'm here. I'm so bitter over you lot. And you go into the chapel, and you go up and you kneel down in front of the altar. Well, let me tell you, Jesus forgave Mary Magdalene, but you lot didn't. You're just you and your relations before you. Excuse me. Your relations. I am speaking.
You people have told
the
these people to
church
shut
kept
up
me down, but they're not keeping me down anymore. And the state. Now I am speaking. I was shut up for years. I'm locked up, but I'm not locked up anymore. Now, I was speaking for the women that were truly, bitterly murdered in Tuam. That's a crime scene, and you went and got the priest instead of getting the police. The justice is a crime scene. Desperate is a crime scene. The bandage is a crime scene. John Wasabi is a crime scene.
Catherine Corless, she might help you.
Excuse me, I can speak up for myself. I speak up for myself. Excuse me. Have some respect for the mothers. Have some respect for the mothers. You just keep running me down the way the church did.
See that when her grandchildren are married to black men.
I guarantee you, I'm delighted to be alive to tell the truth.
Please let this gentleman speak.
Excuse me, I'm still speaking. I haven't finished. If you don't mind, you did interrupt me earlier. You intervened earlier, so I still have my minutes left.
Other people
You don't mind.
People in this room who wish to speak.
Yeah, I'm speaking. I am a survivor, and I'm entitled. I'm a survivor, and it's in my right to speak. I'm speaking out to all these people. I'm speaking to these people. Let them know what went on behind the walls of the notorious mother and baby homes. They didn't put them in coffins. They didn't even put cloth around them. They didn't give them a dignified burial. They didn't have a priest to bless them. They were just thrown into the gutter, thrown in there into the cesspit. That's what they were thrown into because they were of the original sin. And how dare this country, I'm ashamed of this country for what they did to us. And I speak of those who are gone, and the babies and the children. And I am in disgust with everybody here. How dare you? You're all on about your value in your houses, just in case it might get in your way. Because there's 769 children and babies
heard you, okay? Can we
Excuse me,
understand
hold
who's
on a minute, I'm
speaking?
not finished. I want an apology.
With all due respect, I'd like if you were
An
here finished,
apology.
okay? We'd all like that.
I want an apology.
Other
That
people want
one
to
is
speak
a
now, come on, this man here, let him speak.
No, I won't.
Sir,
I won't.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
tell me either.
Come on, yeah, you can speak now.
And
Sir,
I
yeah,
stand
speak
up
there.
for all the
Will
mothers
I
from the
bring them
mother of baby homes.
Stand up for yourself, sit down.
Now I'm finished.
All right, that's good. Yeah, all right.
My name is Eamon Costello, and I was born in Balladreen, Roscommon. We were good people, gentry people, and my mother died suddenly, and I was only 2 years old, and my younger brother was 2 months old, and my other brother was 4, and there was 4 girls, and they were a bit older than me. Now, when mother died, about 3 weeks, Mrs. Flannery's Hotel in Galway was a good friend of my mother, and she told me all the story, and this is what she told me. She said, your mother died, she was taking a bucket of slops to the pigs, because there was 2 things that a lady in the country place had to do, feed the hens and feed the pigs. Yeah. And she was taking a bucket of slops to feed the pigs, and she collapsed in the graveyard, out in the paddock. And she died there and then. And she said she pointed to the cathedral, and Paula came out, and with other people that was there. And of course, the doctor was sent for, and the police. And the doctor came, Dr. Hamilton, and he examined her, and she said she was dead. And that was it. And then what she told me was that she and about 4 other people started looking after us because my mother died. And she said, your father used to go out at about 12 o'clock, to go down to the grave where my mother was buried. And he was doing that for about 3 or 4 weeks. But this time he didn't come back. And when they found him on top of my mother's grave, the police, the doctor was sent for, Dr. Hamilton, the very word she said, and certified him that he'd have to go away. And he was taken to a mental hospital in Ballinasloe in 1935, and he never came out of it. And I never seen my mother or father. And then we were left with 9 children, 4 girls, 5 lads. And my oldest brother was 17, and he was able to ride the horses. So now we left us all, and Mrs. Flannery and 3 or 4 other people, neighbours, were in helping out. So now we lost our mother and father. I was only 2 years old. So after found out all this afterwards, then they had to go to court over it, and myself, Noel was 2 months old, I was 2 years, and Brenda was 4, and we had to be sent to the Sisters of Charity in Kilkenny, same nuns. And then my 4 sisters were sent to a nuns convent in Balhadreen, and I was there till I was 10 in the home, in the babies. Used to take in all little babies, and sometimes there'd be a baby, about 3 baskets left on the front of the porch, and people would come in at night time and put the little babies in the basket and leave them there, maybe the one. And we used to all hear the nuns praying before they went to bed, and they go down to see if some baby was left. And sometimes all it'll be on it is the mother's name, and say Kerry or Cork or some county like that, and that's all that they knew. So we were there till we were 10 and transferred to the industrial school till we were 16. I never seen my mother or father, never knew much about outer life. And the nuns, we were in the convent, and we had to get up in the morning. We said our morning prayers. We had a breakfast, we had a dinner, and we had a supper. And that was true, because there was farms in the convent. So, as I can tell you, then at 10 we had to be transferred to the industrial school in Galway. And in these places you had to behave yourself, or if you didn't, you might get a slap. But there was good people in there, good teachers, and there was good people. And there was 1 or 2 Christian brothers that was very strict, And of course you have to keep discipline.
Yeah.
And we got fed there every time. And I could tell you, I met hundreds of boys that was in the industrial school and some were in the orphanage with me, and we used to reminisce about it. And we kept going back. Myself and my brother my brother was coming from Canada, and I was, when we were about in our middle 30s and 40s, and we kept going back to the mother the orphanage in Kilkenny, and we used to reminisce, and we met some of the people that were still there. And I could say that only for those nuns and where would I be today? I'm 89 in December. I'm 89 in December, and I thank God for my life and what He's given me.
Nice.
You got your redress, you did?
I beg your pardon?
Did you get your redress?
What do you mean redress?
You know, redress for being in the industrial school.
What?
You know the way you got the redress from being in the industrial school.
I know nothing about that.
Well,
Somebody
nothing
told me
happened
about.
to
I
you.
wasn't interested. I learned the trade in the industrial school, and I made a suit for Muhammad Ali when he came over to England, and I was known as the best tailor in England. I learned the trade in the industrial school, and they were till 40 years old, and I had about 6 of them that I made over the years. And I thank God for my life, and I thank God for the nuns, and I thank God for my faith. You will make it up in the morning and say the morning. No, you had to say it. You had to say it. Please sit down. Please sit down. I let you talk, and I didn't agree with it.
You must be getting
I thank God for the nuns. And what had happened to all us boys today? I tell you what, you brought in abortion to slaughter babies. You never mentioned that. The greatest sin the man can commit against Almighty God, you brought it in here in our country, and now where there's two men can get married. Hang on.
No, let's not go here.
You got two men. Two men.
No.
You don't know the difference between a man and a woman.
No, this isn't the issue. Please.
Turn your back on Almighty God. And that's why you're trouble. What if you didn't say anything about all the babies that you stuck in hotels and they can't even see their life?
Please.
What about
I think somebody wind it down a bit. We're going to wind it up a bit.
Yeah, we will. Grant, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're gonna wrap up soon. I just want to have three short questions. Three short questions, and then we'll have a closing word. So this lady here, please. Oh, please. We want to keep this civil.
Thank you, Brian. You mentioned and you described very well about articulation and disarticulation of the bones. The archaeologists went in and, as you described, they investigated the area. They lifted off the top layers. In archaeology, it would be the overlay. In an urban site, it would involve topsoil and rubble, and this was an urban site, so there's rubble. And as you mentioned, they found the bottle of oil from 1968. So that would tell you that was the time that the area was covered finally. So you're talking about reconfiguration of the area in the 80s, but you also said that there was a bottle there from 1968. Now, in terms of the articulation and the disarticulation in the report, it does mention articulation and disarticulation. And the archaeologists, all they could do was take off the rubble. It was a test excavation, so they're going to have to go back in to completely investigate the area and excavate it completely. Then we'll know exactly what was going on in terms of those tanks, as you showed with the picture with the lids. We don't know for sure until they go in there for their full excavation. For the test excavation, all they did was take off the rubble, and they were able to see. Now you saw the pictures are in the report of what they could see. Now they redacted the pictures of bones with respect. They left in a picture of a little baby's shoe, a little blue shoe. You can see that really clearly. That's still there in the ground. They didn't lift that, so they didn't. They took anyway the more recent, looser artifacts like the GTX bottle. So the little shoe was there, and the little bones are there. They lifted what was very loose. They didn't want to disturb too much, but they took what they could just in terms of being able to radioharm it and test. What they could see in the corner, in a kind of at a right angle in one of the little in one of those little tanks was a configuration of bones, and they suggested articulation. Archaeologists are very careful not to say one way or the other until they have evidence. Archaeologists work with evidence. So they said that it suggested articulation. Now you left that out, you didn't mention that point. You went with the point of disarticulation from a previous report. You didn't mention the very detailed, complete test excavation report which suggested articulation. You said disarticulation, so I want to clarify that for everyone here because you didn't.
Yeah.
There was suggestion of articulation.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, what I think I said about the report is that frequently they go up and down. You know, they say one thing and they say one thing and say the opposite a few lines
In
later.
the archaeologist report?
Yes, I would have to say.
They don't. They're very careful to say if it suggests that they're not 100% sure. They won't know until they excavate. It was a test excavation, and the test excavation suggests one case, just one, but it's one, and it's a case that you just meant for everyone here to be very clear about it, be complete about it. They do suggest articulation. Just to correct you on that, because you said the complete opposite.
I quoted Marie Cassidy, the state pathologist, saying
that's an old report before.
Okay. So the main. I'm trying to answer your question with all due respect.
Can you respond to the point?
Yes, I am going to respond. Give me a chance, okay? Give me a chance, right? So the main archaeologist looking at the remains would be Linda G. Lynch. I don't know whether you know her, maybe you do. She was the osteoarchaeologist who worked in it. It's from her that we get the statements whether they're articulated or not articulated. Now here's a quote from the report by Linda G. Lynch. No definitive in situ human skeleton remains were identified, and the entire assemblage of bone comprises disarticulated bones.
Okay, so
these are bones that have completely separated from whatever bone they've originally enjoyed. This typically, no, it's not what I said earlier. I quoted, with all due respect, earlier I quoted Marie Cassidy. Now I'm quoting the osteoarchaeologist. Okay, it's a different person. I am not repeating. With all due respect, I'm definitely not repeating what I said earlier. I quoted Marie Cassidy earlier. I'm now quoting the osteoarchaeologist.
About the articulation.
Yes, that's what I'm answering. You just don't like the answer, do you?
Can I ask you, instead of repeating what you said earlier, because that's what
I'm not repeating what I said earlier. Okay, I'm not. This is a different person, different quotation. Okay, different, or not the same.
You're still insisting your point about disarticulation.
Yes, disarticulation.
What do you have to say about that there is also articulation?
Okay, to clarify, I am saying in this report that they tend to say one thing and say the opposite a few lines later. That's the nature.
So you do.
And I will just give you a quotation from, now if you could just let me finish this quotation from the main osteoarchaeologist. And it wasn't what I quoted earlier, but it's also in the report. No definitive in situ human skeleton remains were identified, and the entire assemblage of bones comprises disarticulation. These are bones that have completely separated from whatever bone they may have originally joined. This typically occurs when after burial and deposition the remains of individuals are disturbed, for example through later burials in the case of cemetery, inadvertently by redevelopment of a burial site, or by animal activity or through context-driven tough changes. But it is true to say, if you read down the report, they try to claim articulation in some particular bones or whatever. But in my opinion, if you read down to it, they overreach themselves on that.
Okay, thank you.
You also have another question. You also asked about the Castrol GTX bottle, right? Now you said that they did topsoil over the site, and therefore that was in the topsoil, whatever. I think.
No, that's not what I said. I was
to clarify.
Into an urban site.
Remove
the overlay.
Overlay. Okay. The Castrol. Okay. To clarify that. To clarify, you've got this structure right at the top of the building. You've got this structure, and it has all these lids on it, right? And that's the sealed place where they have the human remains. Now, in the middle of the human remains, they found the Castrol GTX bottle. Now, the topsoil, etc., are obviously on the top over this particular ossuary. But it's inside the actual ossuary, in the hole, was where they found the Castrol. Yeah, I call it nursery because there are bones in it. That's what you call a structure built to contain bones.
But that's your opinion. That won't be proven until there's an excavation. I think it's very disingenuous of you to keep using that word to mislead the people in this room that it was a nursery, because we don't know that until the archaeologists do a complete excavation. So I think it's a little bit misleading of you for the people in this room to keep calling it a nursery, because that's your opinion. Okay, and you know, I think it would be fairer to the people who are buried there to call it more a burial ground. Okay.
Yeah, but obviously the burial ground is the whole area, but this particular structure, I think, was clearly designed to contain bones. So
in your opinion, it was clearly.
yeah, look, it's my opinion, of course it's my opinion. I can go from talking here, I'm going to be anyone else's opinion.
May I just ask?
We're not stupid, we know what he means.
May I just ask? I would just like Mrs. Corless' opinion. Would you call it nursery?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. Would you consider?
Absolutely not. Absolutely
No,
not.
you wouldn't. Okay.
You should have asked me that question.
Well, we will call it, we would understand what you mean, like, we would have a bit of intelligence.
They said it wasn't a purpose-built burial chamber. The Commission of Inquiry have already stated that in the 5th interim report that came out last April. They said it was not purpose-built for burials. That is in the 5th interim report from the Commission of Inquiry that was set up to do research, to look into the mother and baby homes, okay? You don't want to hear that.
One point on that, and I'm not an expert, and I'm from outside shoot. And one thing I would say that it is an interim report, and all the reports are interim, and they're, just let me finish.
Sure, pardon me, sorry.
They're couched in the language of most probable, or most likely, the language of probability. They have not made definitive. None of us in this room, either you or anybody else, can as yet claim definitive knowledge. So we have to hold back, not be so highly emotive, and allow the facts to speak. Now the facts are not fully defined. We await the final report, but as yet it's the language of probability. So no one here can say definitively, but we are allowed to debate, and we should all be allowed to debate.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And so we just got two hopefully quick contributions.
Through the chair, I would like to concur with the points expressed by this gentleman here.
Okay.
Now, 25 years ago, it's just an aside, and it's a comment. We're from this era. We haven't lived through these times. This lady behind has had her own experience as a child in that. But 25 years ago, while I was nursing our second child, I had to lie down with back injury. And I read a tome of that pig. It was called The Greatest Story Never Told. And it was about the discovery of penicillin and the trials and the hardships of the scientists who discovered penicillin. And the people who died needlessly from TB and preventable childhood illnesses that we take all these vaccines for granted nowadays. My father is an octogenarian and he grew up in this area on a farm. And he told us many, many times, he said, Catherine, the 30s were very hard times, really hard. Now they only had they lived in a 40-acre farm, they only had 2 cows, and it was seven lads. And his brother died from gastroenteritis as a 2-year-old, which is very easily prevented. Now they weren't short of food, because of lack of knowledge at the time. You didn't know about medical research and that. That child, if he got 7 up to date and salt, he'd be alive. But his mother always said, or a neighbour said to his mother, that child was never right. He died from gastroenteritis, but there was something about the child. He wasn't never right from the time he was born. The neighbours noticed it. But Daddy said, and it was in every parish, women had miscarriages like a dose. They laughed because they were on the farms, they were living heavy pots, big skillet pots, light little women, and they'd often miscarry, lift these pots onto open fires. He said his mother had several miscarriages. His granny was the local midwife, and he said women died having babies.
It's like that throughout the world.
That's right, it's correct. The babies, there was a list beside it, it was called a fort, and every parish had one. And these miscarried babies were wrapped in a very piece of colour because they were very poor. So 3 years ago, my father and I went to purchase a grave for my mother. And the local priest is a historian. And he told, would you believe, he said, there was no headstones in Ireland, he said, until about 1860. And if you were really well off. But only in the 1930s could people in Ireland afford a headstone. So my father would concur but they had so little, and the 30s were very hungry times economically. There was an economic war going on. People in the towns and on farms perceived people had plenty of food, but they didn't. They had no money, and the babies were wrapped as reverently as they could, and they'd get a holy water, and they buried in this abyss. And one of the little remains, these buried without ceremonies because the people had no money. So that's my perspective on the whole story. See, we didn't live in those times, and the lady who lived in a home, she's telling her story, and I don't doubt it.
I'm telling that.
That's right, I don't doubt it. This gentleman he lived in a home, and he's telling his story. So everybody has their story. Some good stories are good and some are bad, but you have to be balanced in all these things that this gentleman said here.
Just on the point of money, on the point of money and everybody was poor, in 1938, the nuns were receiving from the state a headage payment of £1.62 per child per week. That translates, I put it through a currency translator, you know, you adjust for inflation, that translates as €110 a week per child. That was at a time when the infant mortality rate in the Tuam home was 5 times that the rest of the country. So let's have no special pleading for the nuns, and how poor they were. They were on £110 a week per child.
They were not.
They never told us, the nuns never told us that we're subsidised by the state.
Where did you get that information
We paid money every week.
Where did you get that information from?
We paid money every week. I'm a survivor, I know the information. I'm a survivor.
Right, we're going to just wrap up this. Just one question left from this gentleman, and then
I know.
Okay, this gentleman in the blue jacket, please.
And to tell that woman up in the front, excuse me, I want to answer your question about Catherine's tone. I did give my evidence, and I gave my truth, to Judge Yvonne Murphy for the Commission of Inquiry. And I told them how the babies were treated, the mothers were treated, and the children, and all about the reject wards. Yeah, all about them.
So why should I come back with a report?
Do you mind if I speak? Or do you have
to we're just finished.
Yeah, John secures nuns cut you down as well.
It's good to have a debate, but there is no excuse for racist remarks from that.
And I know the facts, and I'm telling you the truth, because I was in the home. So I'm telling you the exact facts and truth. And another thing, they weren't well fed. The nuns were fed. They looked after themselves. And they haven't got to watch anything. Everything was done for them, and the priest, and everybody else with it. But let me tell you, I will honour and I will respect all those who have died in the homes and perished, and didn't ask by choice to be placed in the illegal burial grounds. If you buried a dog in a back garden and be locked up, well, they should be brought up and locked up. The nuns.
Thank you.
So there.
This gentleman here.
I'm not going to stand up either.
Go on, stand up.
Come on.
Come on, stand up.
Stand like yourself. Stand up.
Let's all have a beer and have a look at your Can't see you with the beard.
Thanks. Okay, so I'd like to thank you for your presentation. However, as I suppose you're aware, being a learned man, that a lot of your commentary, whether it's sourced academically or not, it's more of a narrative, to give a narrative on the home. And as we heard tonight from different people, whether they had a horrid experience or they actually had a fairly nice experience, such as the gentleman
No, he didn't. He's paid to say that.
Who remarkably made that suit from Muhammad Ali. Should definitely be in local paper. Know more about that story.
Well, I know 200 men that was in the place he was in, and they were raped and battered. Now, do you ever speak about that? No, because you were paid. That's why.
So I suppose you have, which is quite obvious to someone who's coming in to look at your presentation or whatever, you have a different narrative to say the historian that you cited and spoke earlier, that's Catherine in front of us. So I suppose in your opinion, you stand by certain reports, and the very interesting regards the death mortality rate, and you said the transient population, and these are all opinions to help shape your narrative that you want, which basically on the face of it, and I'm not giving out to you or anyone else, that you, on the face of it is to say that the church as itself did the best they could, but you basically are afflicting blame, so to speak, to the state, which you mean Galway County Council, in your book, which I look forward to possibly reading. But what I'm saying is, people here, rightly or wrongly, they're entitled to their own opinions and stuff. And I'm not going to condone any sort of discrimination or racism. But I know the lady that spoke, and she wasn't really given a chance. She can speak for herself, no doubt about it. She wasn't given a chance to retract what she wanted to talk about regards one of the monotheist religions in the world. So she might retract what she's saying, or she might expand on it. But I certainly wouldn't think, Greta, I wouldn't think she is a racist. That's up to her to be.
You know me, Steph, I'm not racist.
No, but
when the Muslims take over, when the Muslims take over,
goodness,
not a race.
That's her exact words.
That's what she said.
I know, I have heard.
Muslims aren't a race.
Yes,
We'll just.
No, I just want to finish.
I'm sorry, it's going on so long. We're just
No, I have to finish, otherwise it makes no sense. I get
let him finish.
okay.
So what I'm saying is, people will have a chance, hopefully, to speak respectfully to each other afterwards, should they wish. But the bottom line of my point is, your narrative is kind of a church-based, sympathetic narrative. Whether you agree with it, what my opinion I'm giving or not, but the real reality out there is the facts haven't completely been determined. And the facts might never be determined. However, that there is evidence whether your book and your lecture slide met the burden of proof, I don't think it did.
The mothers never hit the babies. The mothers didn't abuse the babies. They did not. The nuns
We're just
did.
going to hear from the Galway Archaeological Society president, and then we'll leave it at that. Okay. So.
Just all I wanted to say was two things in fact. You stated that archaeology deals only in facts, but then you quoted from the report evidence or facts. You said then suggests. You use the word evidence suggests. That's a speculative term. So that's a speculation.
That was my point.
That's not fact.
No, that was my point.
Okay, that's good. As long as we clarify that.
He left that out.
The other one was,
that was my point.
the other one was, this gentleman over here said it was 30, no not true, that they were given the equivalent of €115 per week or something like that per child.
110.
110. Do you know how much the British spend on a child in care on this very day? Do you know how much?
Please.
Do you know how much the British state taxpayer pays per child in care per week to this very day? It's the equivalent of €800. So that puts you 135, which I disagree with. I think it was much less than that.
1,500.
Do you know how much the Irish state pays per child in care? And you're right, the treatment of children in care is highly deficient.
It's worse now.
It is. Yeah. And do you know how much it costs the Irish taxpayer? And we just sit down and we accept it. €8,000 per child per week.
Yeah. I don't
Those
accept it. I'm
It's
€8,000
per child per
I
week.
don't
As a
accept
foster
I'll
parent
give you the
myself,
figures if you want.
as a former foster mother myself,
The nuns were not poor is my point.
€365
The nuns
per
were
week
made
per
of the
child. No, I don't get it.
Okay, so
point.
thank you very much. We're just going to have Brian say a few closing words, and then
Well, I hope
thank
he
you all.
apologised to me, because I want an apology.
I'm not apologising. I'm sorry. How can you that? I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank you all for coming. And I have to say, it's a lot different to the other history lectures that I sometimes give. I do a lot of medieval history. I do a lot of history in the
making
16th
sure
century,
that
17th
we're going
century.
to have a collective memory, a collective
Yeah,
memory
what it
of
shows,
what
what it shows
went on
anyway,
in
what
the
it shows anyway, is that
And I
history is
want an
important.
apology
And I'm
from
delighted
you
about that, because I do
for
so much work on it. So,
responding
no, I like it. Thanks very much. Screw you.